Hello, friends, and welcome to the CCDA podcast. My name is Sam Heath, and I'm CCDA's networks developer. I also co-chair the Mass Incarceration Affinity Network, and I lead a statewide nonprofit here in Virginia called the Commonwealth Justice Coalition, and we reimagine public safety and put it into practice. And I'm pleased to be your host for this episode. So today we're going to be diving into and discussing mass incarceration, how profits specifically fit into the criminal legal system, and what we can do to care for our neighbors, both behind bars and their families on the outside. So I'm joined today by two very special guests. First, we have Bianca Tylek here, who's the founder and executive director of Worth Rises. She's also the author of The Prison Industry, How It Works and Who Profits. We're also joined by Pastor Kevin Riggs. Dr. Kevin Riggs pastors Franklin Community Church in Franklin, Tennessee. He's the co-author of Today, the Best Day of My Life, along with his friend KB Burns, who's on death row. And he's the nation's only pastor on death row to a church on death row. And that's a lot. So we'll definitely talk a good bit about that. But let's have each of you give a little bit more of an introduction of yourself and your work. And Bianca would love to start with you and who you are and what the work of Worth Rises looks like overall.
Sure. Thank you so much. I think you've captured my bio pretty quickly. I'm the executive director at Worth Rises, and we're a national criminal justice organization that works to dismantle the prison industry and end the exploitation of people who are incarcerated and their loved ones. In the end, we're trying to build a world in which no individual or entity depends on human caging or control for their wealth, operation, or livelihood. We really think we need to move the economy away from its dependence on the carceral infrastructure and help bring sort of that type of relief to our families and our communities. Importantly, we have an $80 billion industry, and that's what we are working to dismantle. And so we do our work through a number of different mechanisms that include narrative, policy, and corporate accountability, but happy to share more about that later.
Great. Bianca, real quick, so much of the work of Worth Rises that drew me to it and that I think really brought it into this specific episode as we talk a little later about Locked in Solidarity Week and its theme, which is profits in prison. Why did you settle on, years ago when you began Worth Rises, settle on the idea of finances, of looking at the criminal legal system and not just targeting and cutting off those finances, but I know there's that work of moving those finances to where you all would say they could go. But why that specific piece?
Sure. I mean, I think part of it is because for years, our movement has sort of just folded to the fact that an industry existed. Right. We knew that it was the case, but it felt so overwhelming because it's like capitalism, right? Like, how can you do anything about the industry that's been built around prisons and jails? The fact that it is, a billion-dollar industry feels so overwhelming. It is shrouded with a ton of secrecy and opaqueness, thanks to kind of the hidden kind of world of private equity and things of that nature. And it seems so inaccessible. But my particular background is from the financial services industry. And so I spent the first part of my career working on Wall Street and in financial services. And it was through that lens and that experience that I really developed sort of a language, a knowledge basis, an expertise, and a skill set focused on sort of corporations and financial interests, and really challenging this idea that there's nothing we can do. That in fact, billion-dollar corporations also have pretty large vulnerabilities, and there are ways for us to tap into those vulnerabilities to create relief for our community.
Kevin, I'd also love to hear from you. You're a pastor, you're an author, and you're a pastor also in some unique ways and unique spaces. So what does that look like for you in Tennessee?
Yeah, well, it's good to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And Bianca, we have crossed paths. I don't know if you remember, but I worked with you.
I heard Franklin, Tennessee. I was like, oh, I remember.
Okay, good. Well, at least we halted the gas chamber for a little while.
Yeah, we can talk about that.
Yeah, not forever, but at least for a little while, we made a difference there. But yeah, I was born and raised in Nashville, been in Franklin really since 1989 as a pastor. And probably now about 15, 20 years ago, my philosophy of ministry just really started to change and to become more social aware of what's going on. And that led us as a church and then myself as an individual into prison ministry as well as other places. And so we have gone into county jails, state prisons, more recently death row here in Tennessee, which is in Nashville at Riverbend prison. But then even overseas, I've done a lot of work in some prisons throughout Honduras as well. And so all of that has been eye-opening to me. I mean, in my backyard, the same county that I live in is where Core Civic is headquartered, which is, I think, the second largest private prison, but they may be the largest private prison or private detention center now, where they're building detention centers for the immigration issue that's going on. And so we run into them quite a bit. They in this area they try to be philanthropic among everything else, and try to act like a good neighbor, but yet they're constantly in the news for how horrible their prisons are because they cut so many corners because ultimately they're about making money. But going into prisons to me, I've told people the story. I started preaching when I was 15 years old. And one of the first places I would preach was called the Metro Workhouse, which was a low security prison in Nashville, Tennessee. Now, they're not going to let a 15-year-old in any type of prison, but that's where I started preaching. And then, in my mind, I was like, man, when I grow up and pastor and become a somebody, I won't have to go back into prisons anymore. But yet God and his sense of humor brought me back to where I started. And there's really no other place I'd rather be and no other ministry I would rather have than to go into prisons because, Jesus, that's where Jesus is. Sometimes people tell me they want to go into prisons and I say, why? And they're like, well, we want to bring Jesus inside the prisons. And I'm like, no, stay out. You're not going to bring Jesus inside. He's already there. He's always been there. He's waiting on you to come, and you're going to meet him in a new way through people who are in there and who have just a tremendous amount of faith, and their lives have been changed. And it's prison ministry is wonderful. The profit aspect of prison is not wonderful at all, but building relationships with people who are incarcerated for a time being or for life or who are facing death is truly life-changing.
Kevin, I love that frame that you gave of questioning whether or not someone is being a good neighbor. And that's I think of State Farm, and my kids love those commercials, but that's such a biblical frame of what does it look like to be a good neighbor, and that's not just who you live beside, but it's who you encounter. I think that's going to come up a lot in our conversation today. Bianca, let's start big picture. I've said in other spaces that the term mass incarceration now is less of an argument and more of an indisputable description. So when people talk about mass incarceration in the criminal legal system, what are they talking about? And what is really the size, scope, and scale of this thing, the criminal legal system?
I 100% agree. I don't think anyone disputes the fact that we are incarcerating people en masse at this point. And that is in large part because we incarcerate more people in the United States than any other country does, right? So we have today roughly 2 million people who are behind bars in state prison systems, in county jails, in immigration detention facilities, youth jails, and all of that. And so, that's what we talk about when we're talking about mass incarceration. We're talking about the incarceration of millions of people, a system that also churns through its jails roughly 10 to 11 million people a year that are admitted into jails and released. So 5 times what the actual population is at any given point. But our system is addicted to incarceration, to the carceral infrastructure. We use prisons and jails as sort of the kitchen sink resolve for all social failures in our society, whether that be sort of gaps in mental health treatment, substance abuse, poverty, education, job opportunities, sort of you name it, health, physical health. that we really resolve all of that and throw people into prisons and jails rather than caring for our neighbors, which is sort of where we, really started this conversation. And so that is, what we're talking about when we talk about mass incarceration and sort of the massive network, right? The over 3,000 prisons and jails in our country that have been built, to support this particular policy or paradigm. And, for a period of time, as we talk about in the book, there was a prison or jail being built every 8 days through the 90s. Like, that is a wild addiction to carceral infrastructure that we have. And not all infrastructure projects are created the same. And it's time we start building a different infrastructure, an infrastructure for liberty, freedom, and abolition.
There's so many ways to measure this, the cost of incarceration. I mean, you talked about some of the numbers. You talked about the roughly 2 million people that are locked up. Of course, that includes about 2,000 people that are on death row. There's so many ways we can get the numbers of this. We're also really leaning into and thinking about the idea of profits here. And I was really struck by the Prison Policy Initiative's Follow the Money article that came out recently. And they updated their numbers and showed this broad cost of incarceration. And they tallied numbers up to, I believe it was 475 billion, about $500 billion of the cost of incarceration. So not just tax dollars, but they're targeting and looking at also what's the cost burden as it goes to families, even things like phone calls. And I know that's a place where Worth Rises really leans deeply into things. So can you talk a little bit about what are other ways of measuring this cost of incarceration in the way that the cost falls on families, those that are outside?
Sure. I think that number that PPI put out, actually the biggest component of it was loss of income and sort of the economic impact on incarcerated people, on their families, and on the sort of the generational impact, financial impact, and on their communities, right? And so, yeah, I mean, another way that you can take a look at this is certainly the cost that families are shouldering in essentially paying for incarceration. There are so many ways that number, in terms of how much we spend on incarceration, is actually masked. It's not just those, component pieces. We actually just did a partnership ourselves with PPI, with the Prison Policy Initiative last week, illustrating that even that number that they put out is subsidized by the use of prison labor. We estimate that roughly $19 billion is lost in or stolen in wages from people who are incarcerated and are working in these facilities. And if you consider that add another $19 billion to that figure, right? So there are these multitude of ways. You talked about telephone calls. We are talking about people who are incarcerated and their families being charged per minute, sometimes 10 cents, 15 cents, or things like that. And these companies that are in this space are fighting to be able to charge more. There was a series of comments and briefs that were put forward to the Federal Communications Commission just in the last 2 weeks, where these corporations are looking to increase how much they're allowed to charge for calls. And, up until recently, families were already 1 in 3 families are going into debt over the cost of staying connected, those families who have a loved one who's inside. So this has a massive impact on these communities, on these families. And what does that mean? It's not just the going into debt, because what happens after you go into debt, right? You eventually just cut off communication altogether. And now you're saddled with this debt you're holding. You can't bear it anymore. Families are disconnected. And so I really encourage us to also not just think about the financial cost, but the human cost, the relational cost, the community cost, the parent cost, the child development cost, all of that are impacted by the predatory ways that this industry moves, that mass incarceration operates. And it's not just through sort of the fines and fees that are assessed, but consider, for example, prison healthcare. Prison healthcare is in an absolute crisis and disarray. We have, people who are being denied care despite corporations that are given billion-dollar contracts to provide this care. And these corporations, when they deny care, simply take on lawsuits, let those lawsuits for wrongful death or injury mount. And when they mount, they file for bankruptcy. And they file for bankruptcy and wipe out all of these claims and leave all these families with nothing to show. And so, what we see happening in that case is you see $1 billion contracts handed out and the cost being borne in the bodies of people who are incarcerated, who either don't come home because their health deteriorates to that level, or they come home in worse health conditions that are detrimental to their economic and emotional and community kind of future, as well as incredibly expensive for us as taxpayers to then take care of later. And so, that level of extraction that's happening from taxpayer dollars through the physical bodies of people who are incarcerated is yet just another way to evaluate sort of the magnitude and the impact of the harm that this industry and this space has on our people, our families, our communities, and our society.
Mm. I'm thinking about this locally. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and we have a local jail here, the Albemarle Charlottesville Regional Jail. It serves one city and 2 counties. And even between those jurisdictions that it serves are hundreds of thousands of dollars that relate to communications. And you use that language of extraction. And we really have rallied around and asked them to provide a degree of free phone calls, which they have. But before that, we were framing it of these funds being removed from a community where these funds need to stay, where these funds need to be able to do their work and going towards this industry. So this is the prison industry. This is private prisons as well. This is jails too. You also talked about that human cost and what this looks like. And Kevin, I would love to hear about some of your unique connections to prison, to especially in particular death row, and particularly to KB and who he is and what that looks like and how you've seen and experienced that human cost with him and his family over these years.
Yeah, well, KB has said on multiple occasions, being in prison is enough. And, and what he means by that is that in itself is enough punishment. And so all these other things that they do or they tack onto them is really meant to demoralize and to bring them down. And so it does affect their health. I can agree with what Bianca has said and have seen it over and over again, especially on death row where they don't get good health care. The dental situation is really, really rough. Basically, the only thing they do if you have a bad tooth is pull it. And, they don't try to do anything else. There's a situation even now where the governor years ago gave permission for this to happen, but it still hasn't happened. Well, one of the guys on death row wanted to donate his kidney to somebody who he found out needed a kidney, and they were a match. And he went through all the testing, and the governor signed off on it, but the warden and the people in charge have not let him do that. And so that he's trying to do something good, but yet it didn't work out that way. When it comes to the expenses, though, as Bianca was talking, I can share a couple of things. There's a move across the country, and it's really, really strong in Tennessee right now to give all the inmates tablets. And they sell the idea of these tablets of now they can video call their loved ones, or they can get movies and games. They can text on the tablets. But what people don't understand is the millions and millions of dollars that people are making off of that, where now, every text is so much, and the video calls would be the same way, or they get so many free movies, but then they start buying movies and they start buying books and they're at an elevated cost, and somebody is profiting off all of them. But then also there's kind of a sinister idea behind it with all the inmates on tablets. It steps up security because now they got algorithms where they can just keep an eye on everything and not let anything get by. I mean, it's a step beyond listening to a phone conversation. Now they can just go in and pull up anything. And if the person's been on their tablets, they can find out all information. And I know that people say, well, they're in prison, they don't deserve all that kind of stuff. But that's where KB's words come back, that being in prison is punishment enough. Because what will happen is eventually what's happening across the country is when these tablets are introduced, down the road, there's a step now where all personal visitations from family members is stopped, and all visitation becomes visual, a tablet. And of course, you know what that does when people lose contact with their family. Then nothing good comes from that. And in
We
Tennessee,
saw a
again,
degree of that in COVID, right?
yeah,
So
we
much of
saw that
that
in
was shut
COVID.
down, and so many places it's been
Yeah,
slow to be walked back, and
yeah,
visitation has been difficult. And for KB, like, and he's been there. It's a matter of decades, right?
a matter of decades, and his parents are both in their 80s now,
Wow.
and so he's hopeful and he's praying he can get out before either one of his parents pass away. But yet, I've seen it a bunch where people inside walls, they have a loved one who dies while they're in there, and if they're in a maximum security type situation, not just death row, but maximum security, they're not going to be able to get out on leave to go to a funeral. Now, if they're in a lower security prison or a county jail, sometimes there can be permission granted, and a deputy will go with them to the funeral or to say goodbye to their loved one and then bring them right back. But in a state prison, especially maximum security, they're not going to be able to do that. So they don't get that chance to say goodbye. But the other cost, and this works, I think this is across the country, but I know again in Tennessee, there are some things that are free. So like you can get toothpaste or soap or shampoo, toilet paper that are free, but they are below not good. And so, the toothpaste is not good. It's powdery and all that kind of stuff. So if you want just decent toiletries, then you have to purchase them through the commissary, and all those things cost money. And I've seen the commissary list, and I look at it and I'm like, well, these aren't the prices are not really a whole lot different than what I pay at the grocery store. It's not like they get some type of special rate. They're paying, kind of the same amount we are, but yet, in KB's situation, he is the chaplain's assistant and on Unit 2 at Riverbend, and he gets paid 50 cents an hour. And that's the highest anybody on death row can get paid.
Well,
So people who work in the kitchen.
Introduce us to KB and his story, because often when I talk about him, I say he's the only pastor on death row to a church on death row. So what does that mean and look like for him?
Yeah, well, KB, we believe, was wrongfully convicted. He didn't kill anybody. He was there, and he was actually charged with I've gone brain dead now, but the felony murder, where basically if you're the driver in a getaway car in a bank robbery and somebody on the inside dies, you can be charged with a felony, even though you didn't kill any. You can be charged with felony murder, even though you didn't kill anyone. And that was KB's situation. And he was in his 20s when he went through this, and now he's in his 50s. It's about 31, 32 years that he's been incarcerated, and about 28 of those years would be on death row. He was in the Shelby County Jail in Memphis for 3 years as he was going through the trial. But he was brought up in a Christian family. His dad was a pastor, and he felt called to preach at a young age. But in his teenage years, kind of, like a lot of us do in teenage years, we struggle with things. And so very early when he was arrested, before he was arrested, he recommitted his life to Christ, started leading Bible studies in the Shelby County Jail. And then when he got to the death row, he's been a model inmate. And over time, he became the chaplain's assistant. When I met him now about 13 years ago, he and I just bonded really, really quickly. And he would show me around. I mean, I would talk to all the guys on death row, and the reason they would talk to me is because KB. It's kind of like if you're a friend of KB, you're my friend as well. And so that's kind of how the relationship developed. But then over time, I heard, in my tradition, we just say God spoke to me, or the Spirit, I felt in my spirit that KB needed to be ordained. Because one day he told me I was the pastor on death row, and I was like, no, you're the pastor on death row. The only reason people talk to me is because of you. And on the way home that day, I heard in my spirit God say, you need to ordain him. So we talked to our elders about that, and they agreed. He went through the same ordination process that I went through. It took a couple years. Then the prison bent over backwards, actually, and allowed us to have an ordination service inside death row, where he was able to invite 30 people. And so his family was there. Some other friends were there. And the first thing he did after he was ordained was serve everyone communion. And I tell people, that's a unique experience when you get communion served from someone who's condemned to die. And it sounds a whole lot like what happened with Jesus. And so a month or so after he was ordained, again, in my spirit, I felt God saying, now you need to help him start a church. And so we talked about that, and I told him specifically, we want a church service, not another Bible study, not another, AA meeting or discussion group, because there really wasn't just a church service in death row. And the tagline was basically a church for the men on death row, led by the men on death row. And we found out later that went against prison policies. And so we've had different times when it's been a struggle to keep it going. But there's some type of policy where an inmate cannot be in any position of authority. And I was like, well, if you know anything about pastoring, you're not supposed to be in a position of authority anyway. It's service, not authority. But it's still going on. It's called the Church of Life, is what we named it. So the Church of Life on death row, and then doors have opened up for him. He has corresponded with a guy in the prison in Honduras who is also similar story, became ordained and started pastoring a church while he was in prison. And when I would go to Honduras, I would take letters to him, and then he would write letters back to KB, and he's corresponded with other prisoners that way. And then through CCDA has really taken on a national and somewhat international role where people all over the country really know. When I go to CCDA conferences, a lot of people don't know me, but those say, "Oh yeah, you're KB's pastor." That's kind of how they know me. And so, it's been life changing for me. And to date, KB has not received a date of execution. We're hoping and we're hopeful that the governor will give him clemency. He's gotten some new lawyers that some people are actually paying for. So it's not the public defender's office. It's some new lawyers looking at things and helping with all of that. And so we're hopeful. Tennessee has started executions again. Already scheduled 4 executions for next year. One will be a woman, which, as far as we know, will only be the second woman in Tennessee history that will be executed. And KB is not on that list. But 2027, 2028, it could get a little dicey. And the way things work, usually a governor doesn't even entertain clemency on someone until that person gets a death date. And so it's just really, that in and of itself is just really horrible that you can't even, you're sitting there, you're innocent, and no one's even going to listen to you again until you get that death date. And then that kicks up all kinds of possible appeals and clemency. And so, but he's optimistic. He's always positive. And
hence the title of the book, right? And I want to flag that again. Today, the best day of my life. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. But
if you were to meet him,
his phrase. He says
if you were to
that
meet him and say, "Hey, KB, how you doing?" He'd say, "Oh, today's the best day of my life," and he really means that. It's not a denial kind of thing. He really means that. And there's a story in the book of where that came from. And he was patterning himself after a pastor he had when he was very young who would say that. And he decided that was going to be his phrase, and he really does. He believes that when he was found guilty and sentenced to death, he had a vision, and where basically God told him, again the way that he would tell it, "I'm sending you into death row for a purpose and for a reason, and when I'm done with you, I'll get you out." And he believes getting out means physically, not you're going to die and go to heaven. But when he has finished the work God had for him to do on death row, that he will walk out of there. So that's his faith. And so in a sense, he sees himself as a missionary that was sent behind walls. And it's the very definition of what we call in the church world of incarnational ministry, that you become one of them so that you can minister to them.
Wow. Thanks, Kevin. There's so much that's shocking and moving in that story and in that book. Bianca, I thought of you and Worth Rises recently because my daughter came home and they're learning about the Civil War, and they're doing one of those wax museum presentations, and she had a couple people that she could be, and she said, "Dad, I want to be Abraham Lincoln." I'm like, "Okay, let's talk about him and his role and what happened with the 13th Amendment." And I was really trying to dig into some of those nuances, and would love to hear more about, with Worth Rises, the specific in the exception campaign. What is that? Why is that important? Because so much of that, I think, relates to what Kevin is sharing about KB and his story.
Absolutely. So, I think what you were probably talking to your daughter about, but we can make sure that everyone understands, is that the 13th Amendment is the amendment that is celebrated for having abolished slavery. But what many people don't know is that within the 13th Amendment is an exception clause. In fact, we did some research and found that 88% of Americans likely do not know that the 13th Amendment includes an exception clause that reads, except as punishment for a crime, which means that in our country in 2026, 250 years since our sort of founding, slavery is very much still legal. So long as you have been convicted of a crime, you can be enslaved. And that is a wild, I think, sort of fact that many people don't know, don't understand, and need to. Because anytime we create such an opening for the violation of people's basic human rights, it is not before long that we will expect it to hit all of us, right? In fact, just today, the Supreme Court made a decision on a case brought by Geo Group, one of the nation's largest private prisons, in which the company had been sued for essentially taking advantage of immigrant detainees and paying them nothing or just $1 a day and forcing them to work. And, their claim to the court was there shouldn't even be a civic trial because we are a government contractor and such we should have immunity as just as the government would. And thankfully, unanimously, the Supreme Court struck that down and sent it back to the trial court. But we see this, sort of exception to the 13th Amendment, to our protection for basic, the basic protection from slavery is so fragile, right? Like if all it takes is the, small sort of breaking of some criminal law, even though, we have seen criminal law change dramatically suddenly now in states, not suddenly, I would say with the work of so many, it's the case that we have like marijuana legalization, but for so many decades, that was criminalized and folks could be enslaved because of it. And in fact, that's what we saw during the Reconstruction era, after the passage of the 13th, is the passage of Black codes, which were laws that were designed solely to criminalize free Black people so that they could be re-entrenched into a system of enslavement in just a different format, right? And that is why we saw such a massive shift from, the prison population being predominantly white before the Emancipation Proclamation to the prison population being primarily Black in those years that immediately followed the proclamation. So, what we are working on now is with the In the Exception campaign is a fight to end that exception, as it states, right? And to say, no, in fact, it's a basic human right that all people have to be protected from slavery. At no time should you lose that right. I really encourage people to who, are struggling with this concept to finish the sentence, slavery is okay when. And if that is a sentence that you struggle to finish, then get on board. Slavery is just never okay, right? It also doesn't lend itself to any positive or productive outcomes for our society. When we take away those kind of basic human rights, we are trying to strip people of their human dignity, right? Of their self-value. And if you do that to people and you break people, then you cannot expect people to come back to society with the mental sort of fortitude or, self-worth and all of that to really be productive and operating in our society in a way that we all want each other to be. And so, all of this is problematic. And I should also say that the fight to end prison slavery, as we are with the End the Exception campaign, and what that means is, you should say, it's just a new amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would bar slavery in all cases, is not just about wages, right? Wages is, I think, what often becomes the big piece of the puzzle. But as we said, it's like when, during chattel or antebellum slavery, it was this concept of, being 3/5 of a person, of like not being recognized for your humanity if someone can do that to you. And that same thing remains true when we talk to people who are currently incarcerated. It's not that people don't want to work, it's that people don't want to be enslaved because of what that treatment signifies, right? And how it makes one feel, which means that it's not just about wages, but it's about basic labor protections like working conditions. People who are incarcerated are far more likely to be injured or even die on the job than others because they don't have OSHA protections to workplace safety, right? They don't have EEOC for protections, which protects against discrimination, which means we see a lot of the highest paying jobs going to folks who are incarcerated who are white, as opposed to some of the lowest paying jobs or the field work that is still being actually given to people who are Black and brown in our system. And so it is a wide range of things. But even when we do consider wages, I do want to put this thought in people's minds. When we take wages from people who are incarcerated, we are not just taking wages from them. We are also taking child support from their children. We are taking sort of medical and parental support from their parents, from their spousal support, and perhaps, one that if none of that feels convincing, we're also taking away people's ability to pay restitution to victims, right? If you have a $10,000 restitution fine that you are supposed to pay to your victim, but you make 8 cents an hour, your victim is not going to get what they're due, right? In fact, I talked to one person who said it would take them 189 years based on their wages to pay their victim back for what they owe under restitution. And so the question is, like, to what end? Like, you don't owe me a debt. You didn't cause me harm. But if you cause that person harm and you can't even pay them back because we, as the state, as the taxpayers or whatever, are extracting your labor in these ways, I mean, the system just doesn't make sense in any way. And the last thing I'll sort of say circles back to what I mentioned at the top, which is that when we allow these types of violations to happen, to sort of the least of us, they will eventually make their way back to us. And the best example of that in this situation is that this matter has actually been raised as part of the NCAA's legal case around amateur or college athletes. In fact, the NCAA argued that if there is an exception for people who are incarcerated, perhaps there should be other exceptions. And we are talking about college students, right, and college athletes. And the fact that that even came up, thankfully, the court admonished the NCAA and the lawyers for even, trying to go there. But it really does go to show, that all of our basic human rights, let alone civil rights and civil liberties, are so frail and so fragile that we must protect them for all people at all times. Otherwise, we are opening the door to so much more.
Kevin, you and I have co-chaired the Mass Incarceration Affinity Network for a few years. You many more years than I have. I feel we toggle between two different names of it. The other being the Locked in Solidarity Network, and each year we have a Locked in Solidarity Week. So can you talk about what that is and what the focus is for that this year? Because each year we have a theme.
Yeah. Locked in Solidarity is a week where there's just an emphasis put on mass incarceration throughout our network, where we deal with a lot of different topics. And it lasts a week long with different seminars and webinars and just discussions and videos. It was moved to April this year, and right now the dates are slipping my mind. It's after
That's
Easter.
all right. April 12th through the 19th.
Yeah, April 12th through 19th. This year's theme is profit in prison, or the prison industrial network, and so we're going to be talking about these things about, at least I think from our perspective, that in no way should prisons be a profit-making machine where people can go to basically in the stock market, exchange and make profits from people incarcerated, and what that leads to. It's just another form of taking humanity away from people, where people are profiting off of my oppression, be it that I'm guilty or not guilty. They're profiting off of of a system, and then that just opens up doors to mistreat people. So the food's getting too expensive, so let's find a way to cut back on food or cut back on medicine, so that the people who have invested in our company will make a profit. Mm-hmm. The Bible has a lot to say about making profit by oppressing people. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to look at that. Part of that is a sermon study teaching guide that can be used in churches that I've put together now for several years. In the last few years, KB has helped put that together with me. We worked together on that. And we're thinking about maybe for the sermon, obviously talking about the profit margin in prisons, but also a play on words and talk about profits, PROPHETS, profits inside prison. Those like KB and others who are serving God and doing incredible things while they are incarcerated. So kind of a play on words. And, the Bible says a whole lot about prisons. I mean, I've got a talk that I give when I go to prisons, and they want me just to speak on something. We're just starting with the Old Testament, and where the book of Psalms says that God hears the prayers of prisoners, especially those condemned to die. There's all kinds of passages in the Old Testament about people who are incarcerated. You think of the towns that were set up in the law for people who have committed crimes they were to go to, and the purpose of that was redemption and reconciliation, not punitive at all. And then, Jesus ended up being a felon, so Jesus was a felon. He was condemned. He was executed by the state. And so you have that. And then I don't understand all of this, but sometime between death and resurrection, the Bible says he went to the spirits in prison and preached to them. And so what you see is, that God has a special place in his heart for people who are incarcerated. You see that from beginning to middle to end of the Old Testament. You see that from beginning to middle to end of Jesus' life. I mean, the last person Jesus talked to before he died was another person condemned to die. And then, of course, there's all kinds of stories in the Bible of people who were incarcerated. And read Hebrews 13. At the end of that chapter, you see all kinds of horrible things that happened by people who were killed and tortured by the state for crimes they did not commit, or even if they did, they were still mercy is still to be shown at some point. And so, but this whole idea, we've talked about it for years, about trying to do something around profits in the prison industry. And now, of course, with this administration and wanting to build all these new detention centers, that you're talking hundreds of billions of dollars these private prison companies stand to make. And it comes back to the counties as well. Like my county jail here has contracts with the state. So people who are state prisoners, if they need to be placed somewhere, they can be placed at the county level. And usually the contracts mean that the state has so many beds reserved for that, for a state prisoner to come to a county jail, and the county makes so much money per bed, regardless if there's anybody in that bed or not. And this is not private prison. This is just kind of the way it kind of works even within that. Okay, now the state prison was going to contract with the county jail that they can house so many state prisoners in that jail if necessary. And that contract is basically you're paying so much money a bed, even if nobody's in that bed. So the county starts to make money. And of course, that's one way the most of the contracts with the private prisons are set up that way with the government as well, that they'll guarantee a 90-something% bed rate. And so they're going to get paid that money whether anybody's. And one thing we haven't even talked about yet is how the profits continue after a person is released through being on probation. And they have to pay for that. And any person incarcerated will tell you the most dangerous time to be in prison is the months and weeks leading up to your release. And then the most dangerous time to be on probation is the closer you get to flattening out, what they say, or not being on papers anymore. And so the closer you get to the end of your probation, the odds of them finding something to get you to violate your probation so they can put you back in prison or keep you in the probation system where people, again, are making money it's just kind of the way the system works. Now, if you ask people, they're going to deny all that, but that's the way the system
Yeah.
that's the way the system works.
Yeah.
And so it's to keep people. And then, because I can't remember now the stats about not just how many people are in prison, but how many, especially African-American males, are in the system at some point or another, be it juvenile detention, incarceration, pretrial, release, probation. And
it's wild. For men, it's about 1 in 3. For Black men, for those that are in prison, it's about 40% are people who are Black. So, obviously disproportionate statistics. And
all this is a money making machine.
Yeah.
And it's, it's hard to stop, but we have to try and just bring attention to these things. But anytime you start messing with the economy, the powers that be, they're going to push back on you.
Yeah. Well, I'll say again for our friends listening, Locked in Solidarity Week, April 12th through 19th, that week-long focus on mass incarceration and what people can do. And as we start to wrap up, Kevin, Bianca, one brief question for each of you as we head to the end. So, Bianca, CCDA, the Christian Community Development Association, has 8 different principles that are really at the core of its work. And one that stood out to me as it relates to your work is this idea of redistribution, especially as we think about funds and money. So how is the idea of redistribution baked into the work of Worth Rises?
Absolutely. It's interesting. I've actually never quite thought about it exactly in those terms, like redistribution specifically. But a lot of our work is based on protecting the limited resources of people who are impacted by the system. Mm-hmm. And to the extent possible, also returning those resources, right? So meaning things that were taken unjustly or unlawfully, that were exploitative or predatory. And it's just, it's critical that families get that back. I mean, for me, that concept sort of also marries into like reparations, right? And thinking about what it means for all of that stolen labor we've been talking about, all of those like excessive and unjust fees, all of that abuse that people's bodies have suffered through this system, all should be, repaired as just a baseline of what the social contract, right, is that we have to each other, is that we must repair before we can sort of move forward. And so it's awareness, it's a acknowledgement of that care and concern of wrongdoing that puts us in the right direction, such that we can avoid making, causing the same harm in the future. If we don't acknowledge, we will undoubtedly reinvent all of these ways in which we harm people. And so, our hope is to, in many ways, and what we've been able to do, right, is protect some of those limited resources, redistribute some of those resources from folks. I'm proud to say that our work on making communication free in prisons and jails has now saved families over $600 million in, just the last 8 years or so. So that's really incredible for those who need it most, really, because the people who are incarcerated, you were talking about the disproportionate impact on certain communities, but, undoubtedly the largest community of people who are incarcerated are people in poverty, right? People who are low income. No matter what sort of other demographics are represented, it is overwhelmingly people who have little, right? And that should be a huge sign to us of what we are doing, that it is, blatantly unethical, immoral to subject people who, have little in our society to such gross harm. And we're just trying to right that the bit that we can.
Kevin, briefly, let me turn to you. In your work and ministry, how do you see Christian community development philosophy playing a role?
Yeah, well, one of the other principles of CCDA is church, church focused or church based. And so for me, it does begin with the church to do that. And Jesus, in his parable of the sheep and the goats, specifically said to go and visit those in prison. And again, when Jesus announced his ministry at his hometown synagogue, and quoting from Isaiah, I've come to set the captive free. And so it begins with the church. And a positive note of that is there are so many churches and church organizations who are in prisons already. That's a positive of that. The negative of that is there always could be more, or there's a missing link there where their churches will go inside to minister or to meet and to be with and build relationships with people who are incarcerated. But when those people get out of prison, those same people aren't really there to help. I'll help while you're inside, but outside, we don't want that person around our kids, or we don't want that person in our church because of whatever their background may be. And so I think churches have got to think through that. But the churches and all religious groups, not just Christian churches, but the churches and religious groups really are the ones who need to be in prison. They're the ones who can build the relationships, and they're the ones who can help on all kinds of ways that the prison itself cannot help or refuse to help.
There.
Yeah, and so it's our responsibility as followers of Jesus to go inside prisons, because again, that's where Jesus is. And so again, you're not taking Jesus in there with you. You're going there to meet Jesus. Because he's there, he's always been there, and he's waiting to meet you there. And that might shock some people, but that's really what it is. I mean, we have a saying at our church that the way you love a God you cannot see is by loving those you can see. The way you serve a God you cannot see is by serving those you can see. And so it's an act of worship then to go in and to serve the people who are incarcerated. You're serving Jesus. We're not the hands. When we go into prisons, we're not the hands and feet of Jesus going into prison. When we go into prison and we hold a prisoner's hand, that prisoner's hand is the hand of Jesus. If we go and put money on his commissary so he or she can get a new pair of shoes, we're not the feet of Jesus. That person incarcerated's feet, that's the feet of Jesus. Yeah. Jesus said, if you do it to the least of these, you've done it to me. Yeah. And so you see Jesus in the incarcerated, probably more than the incarcerated see Jesus in you. You see Jesus in the incarcerated, and so you are serving Jesus by going in there. And
well, friends who are listening, again, Bianca Tylek, Kevin Riggs, who are here, thank you both not just for coming, but for this work on the ground and what it looks like on a hyper local, but also on a national scale. And thanks to everybody for listening to the CCDA podcast. We're grateful that you joined us today. If you want to learn more about CCDA and how you can get involved, you can check out the show notes of this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is produced by Sarah Callant in association with Christina Four, and we'll be back with another episode featuring CCD practitioners who are committed to seeing people and communities experience God's shalom. And we'll see you then. Thank you.